The applause was a beautiful lie, and for nearly 20 years, it was the soundtrack to my life. My name is Marilyn, and today, at 84 years old, I live a life so profoundly peaceful that sometimes I catch myself smiling for no other reason than the sun is shining on the rhododendrons in my little yard. But that peace was bought at the highest price, a currency of silence and fear paid out over decades. I'm speaking to you now from the sunniest room in my house, the window overlooking the quiet street where I finally learned to breathe again. Everyone in our town, nestled just outside Boston, loved my husband, Kenneth. They adored him with a devotion that felt almost biblical, a deep, abiding respect you could cut with a knife. They loved his reassuring smile, his educated words, his hand always extended to offer help or counsel. For the people in our community who were navigating the booming but often uncertain years of the post-war American dream, Kenneth was the emblem of prosperity, stability, and decency. He was the upright man, the model husband, the exemplary family man. Everyone loved him, except the one person who saw his mask crumble in the evenings, when the heavy front door of our perfect colonial home closed behind him. That person, the only one privy to the chill behind his dark, severe eyes, was me. I need to tell you my story. This isn't just a tale of invisible imprisonment. It is, above all, the story of a liberation, of the journey my soul undertook to reclaim its own voice. And I hope deeply that in sharing this, I can reach someone out there who is still lost in their own darkness. My life, and the beginning of my unmaking, started in the late 1950s. It was an America full of big cars, bigger aspirations, and a fervent belief that hard work meant an easy life. Our town was one of those quintessential New England communities. White clapboard houses, pristine lawns, and a main street anchored by the imposing First National Bank and the towering spire of the First Baptist Church. Life was measured by the smell of Sunday roasts, the sound of the school bell, and the cheerful chatter of the ladies at the annual church bazaars. I was barely 20, fresh out of business school, and my life smelled of freshly pressed cotton and simple dreams. I dreamed of a love like the one my parents shared, a partnership built on quiet respect, a house full of children, and the calm happiness of a life well lived. I was naive, perhaps, but happy in that naivety. My world was a perfect, comforting circle. And then, into that circle, Kenneth stepped. He wasn't from our town. He arrived from the city, a transfer to the First National Bank, destined for management. His arrival was an event that shattered the monotony of our days. In a place where families had known each other for generations, an outsider was always a spectacle. But Kenneth wasn't just any novelty, he was a phenomenon. Tall, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit, even on a Saturday, he carried himself with a confidence that commanded respect. His diction was precise, devoid of the local New England colloquialisms, and his attire belonged to a world of Ivy League education and ambition. I remember the first time I saw him as if it were yesterday. I was helping out at my father's stationery and printing shop, the smell of fresh paper and ink thick in the air. The bell above the door chimed, and he walked in. The midday sun framed him for a moment, and I caught my breath. It wasn't just his sharp appearance, it was the sheer authority he exuded. His dark, deep, and serious eyes rested on me. It wasn't the casual, flirtatious gaze of the local boys. It was a stare that seemed to look right through me, making me feel suddenly exposed, vulnerable. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and deep, causing an unexpected flutter in my stomach. He bought a stack of business letterhead, and my hands fumbled as I counted out his change. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible smile, and in that moment, without knowing it, my destiny took an irrevocable turn. His courtship was a masterpiece of strategy and patience. He didn't have the clumsy haste of my peers. Every move was calculated, every gesture a small brick placed to build the fortress of my trust. He started coming to the stationery shop every day under the pretext of needing supplies. He'd exchange a few cultured words with my father about the economy and the national political climate with a surprising competence for a city man. Then he began directing a few compliments my way, never audacious, always respectful. "These hands create real elegance," he once said, indicating a particularly well-designed greeting card. Soon, he asked my father for permission to walk me home after Sunday church service. Our first walks were a ritual of formality. My younger sister, Sandra, followed a few steps behind us, a small, stern chaperone. Kenneth never sought physical contact, but he conquered me with words. He spoke of books, of art, of distant cities like New York and Chicago. He opened windows onto a universe I hadn't known existed, making me feel intelligent and special. I was captivated. For the first time, someone saw me not just as the stationery shop owner's daughter, but as a person with a mind and a soul. My family was won over with the same deft skill. For my mother, who dreamed of a better future for me than her own, a life free of the daily grind, Kenneth was a gift from Providence. "He's a man of gold, Marilyn," she'd tell me. "Educated, respected, with a position at the bank. He'll give you everything we never had." My father, a practical man of few words, was seduced by his seriousness. "He has a good head on his shoulders," he decreed one evening after Kenneth had stopped by to discuss local business tax incentives with him. Sandra, my sister, was the only one who harbored a shadow of a doubt. "I don't know, Lynn," she told me one afternoon as we folded laundry. "He's too perfect. It's like he's playing a part. Sometimes when he looks at you, his eyes are cold, like two pieces of polished glass." Her observation bothered me. I attributed it to jealousy, to her more cynical nature. "You're just envious," I replied sharply, regretting it an instant later. But the truth was, I didn't want to see it. I was too blinded by the light he seemed to radiate. When Kenneth asked for my hand, he did so in the most impeccable manner. He didn't address me, but my father, in the living room after supper, as tradition dictated. The answer was an enthusiastic yes. The news spread through the town like wildfire. I was the luckiest girl in the world. My wedding day was like living inside a dream. The First Baptist Church was packed. The scent of wax and old wood mixed with the aroma of the white lilies adorning the altar. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, my heart pounding so hard it made the lace of my veil tremble. I saw Kenneth standing there, waiting for me. He was magnificent in his dark suit. When our eyes met, he smiled, and in that smile I saw the promise of a lifetime of happiness. His vows, spoken before Pastor Hayes, our longtime minister, resonated as solemn and immutable. Love, honor, protection. Until the end of our days. And I believed him with all the strength of my 20-year-old self. The wedding reception was a triumph of small-town joy. Long tables were set up in the church hall, laden with simple, abundant food, red punch, and laughter that set tongues loose. I danced with my father, my uncles, my cousins. But the moment that truly sealed my happiness was our first official dance as husband and wife, a slow tune played by a local jazz trio. Kenneth held me close, his body a solid fortress against mine. "You are Mrs. Kenneth Moretti now," he whispered in my ear, his voice a warm breath. "No one can ever hurt you again. I am here to protect you." And I felt like the safest woman in the world, oblivious that my protector and my jailer would be the very same person. Our honeymoon in Maine was a brief, enchanting interlude. The coast, the sun, the freedom of finally being alone. But it was there, in that bubble of happiness, that the first, most subtle crack formed. One evening, dining at a small, rustic seafood restaurant by the harbor, the owner, a jovial and loud man, recognized something familiar about me, and we discovered we shared distant, obscure relatives. The discovery quickly made us cheerful, and between a glass of wine and a shared story, I let out a booming, genuine laugh, one of those full-bodied sounds that came naturally to me. I saw Kenneth's expression change for a single fleeting instant. His smile died, replaced by an indecipherable shadow. Later, in our room, as I brushed my hair, he sat on the bed and called my name. His tone was measured, almost pedagogical. "Marilyn, my love, we need to discuss your behavior tonight." I looked at him, confused. "My behavior?" "Yes," he continued, with glacial calm. "That laughter, that familiarity with a near stranger. It is not appropriate for a woman in our position. The wife of a future bank vice president must maintain a certain decorum. People judge, my dear, and through you, they judge me." I tried to stammer a defense, to explain the spontaneity of the moment. He cut me off with a raised hand. "I am not angry. I only want the best for you. I am instructing you, helping you become the woman I know you can be. You must learn to control yourself. Your exuberance is charming in private, but in public, it can be misconstrued." His words landed on me like stones. I suddenly felt vulgar, inadequate. That night, when he came to me, there was none of the tenderness of the previous days. His touch was demanding. His body moved over mine with a kind of impatient right. It was his husband's right, as was often said then. But in my ignorance, I had dreamed of something different. A fusion of souls, not an assertion of possession. I stared at the ceiling, feeling tears press behind my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt profoundly alone, even in a man's arms. Upon our return, life settled into a pattern. We moved into the prettiest house in town, a 2-story colonial with a small manicured garden in the back. It became my kingdom, a place where I tried to recreate the warmth and love of my parents' home. But my home was governed by unwritten rules, Kenneth's rules. Every object had to be in its place. Every meal had to be served with near military precision. My small rebellions, a vase of wildflowers on the dining table, a decision made without consulting him, were met with a heavy silence or a calm, sharp lecture on the necessity of order and discipline. His career, meanwhile, was unstoppable. He became a vice president at the bank, as he had predicted. His influence extended throughout the town. He became the man everyone turned to. Farmers for a loan, young couples for a mortgage, widows for advice. And he dispensed his wisdom with an air of paternal benevolence that charmed everyone. I witnessed his ascent, playing the role of the devoted, proud wife. And in a way, I was. I was proud of his intelligence, his ambition. But a part of me was beginning to feel like an accessory, a well-cared-for prop in the perfect staging of his life. The birth of our first child, Linda, was a breath of fresh air in that suffocating atmosphere. When I held her in my arms for the first time, I felt a love so fierce and unconditional that I felt I could move mountains. I hoped, with all my might, that the arrival of this small creature would soften Kenneth, would bring a touch of true joy within our walls. And for a while, it seemed to work. I saw him hold her, smile at her. But soon, Linda too became an instrument of his control. He criticized the way I fed her, my excessive apprehension, my choice of lullabies. "You are spoiling her," he would say. "Women are too emotional. She will need a firm hand to be raised correctly, mine." The first time he laid hands on me wasn't a slap. It was far more subtle. I wanted to visit my sister, Sandra, who had just married Donald and moved to the next town over. It had been weeks since I'd seen her. Kenneth decided it wasn't necessary. "Your sister distracts you from your duties," he said calmly. "The house, your child, and your husband come first." "But she's my sister," I protested, my voice trembling with injustice. It was then that he stood up and approached me. He grabbed my forearm, his grip like a steel vise. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his eyes 2 slits of ice. The pain in my arm was acute, but the terror that chilled my blood was far worse. It lasted only a few seconds. Then he let go, with the same casualness one might brush dust from a coat. "Do we understand each other?" he asked, in his usual measured voice. I nodded, unable to speak. That evening, at the dinner table, I had to hide the purplish bruises his thumbs had left on my skin under a long sleeve, despite the heat. From that day on, I learned my lesson. My life shrank to the confines of the house walls. Visits to my parents became rare, and my sister's letters received short, vague replies. Kenneth had built his golden cage with invisible bars made of duty, respect, and fear. The peak of his public consecration came during the town's annual Founders' Day celebration. The entire town was celebrating. There were stalls, the marching band, and colored lights strung between the buildings. The climax of the festivities was a speech by the town selectmen in the square, followed by a benediction from Pastor Hayes. That year, the selectmen decided to establish an award, a Medal of Honor for the most deserving citizen. And of course, the award went to Kenneth. I watched him ascend the makeshift stage, acclaimed by the applause of the entire square. He was humble, almost shy. He thanked everyone, spoke of the value of community, faith, and family. Then, he searched for me in the crowd and smiled. "And I could do none of this," he said, his voice amplified by the microphone, "without the silent and loving support of my wonderful wife, Marilyn." The applause doubled. Everyone turned to look at me. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, eyes filled with admiration, with benevolent envy. I smiled, feeling the muscles in my face stretch unnaturally. I applauded, too. I applauded the finest actor I had ever known. I applauded my condemnation, my prison, my tormentor. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the crowd and the love of my town, I had never been so cold, so alone, so desperately imprisoned. The cage was perfect. It shone brightly under the festive lights, and everyone admired it. But only I felt the cold of the metal on my skin. And a question, like a poisonous whisper, made its way into my mind. Would I die in here? That evening, after the ceremony in the square, I walked home beside Kenneth, the echo of the applause still ringing in my ears. He was radiant, accepting congratulations from passers-by with a studied humility that made me nauseous. I smiled, nodded, and played my part. But inside me, the cold I had felt in the crowd had turned into a lump of ice in my chest. For the first time, my situation appeared with terrifying clarity. I was not simply an unhappy wife. I was an actress in a play written by someone else, a play in which my character had no lines, only smiles. When the front door closed behind us, the silence that fell was more deafening than any applause. Kenneth took off his jacket, folded it with meticulous care, and placed it on a chair. Then he turned to me. The public smile had vanished, replaced by a neutral, almost bored expression. "It went well," he said, as if commenting on the weather. "The selectmen mentioned a possible role on the town council. Our family is becoming important, Marilyn. I hope you understand the weight of that responsibility." I didn't answer. What could I say? I simply nodded. He walked past me to go upstairs, stopping for an instant to rest a hand on my head, a gesture that was not a caress, but an act of possession, as one might do with a faithful dog. "You were good tonight," he added. Silent and graceful, as is proper. He went up, and I remained alone in the foyer, surrounded by the ghosts of our perfect life. Responsibility. His was the success. Mine was the responsibility not to stain it with my inadequacy. The months that followed were a slow, inexorable sinking into a gray routine, a swamp of identical days. My life was a meticulous ritual, orchestrated to avoid any friction. Waking up before dawn to prepare his breakfast. The house had to be a mirror, everything in its place, because disorder, he said, was symptomatic of a disordered mind. His meals had to be cooked exactly the way he liked them. The steak medium rare, but not too bloody. The potatoes mashed, but not too creamy. The coffee strong, but not bitter. Any deviation, even minimal, was noted and commented on. Not with anger, but with a paternal disappointment that made me feel like a stupid and negligent schoolgirl. Little Linda was my only light. With her, I could still be myself. I sang her the songs my mother sang to me. I told her stories of the stationery shop, of the smell of ink and paper, of a simple, warm world that felt increasingly distant. But even my love for my daughter became a minefield. Kenneth began to correct my approach. "You're spoiling her with all those cuddles," he'd say, if he saw me hug Linda after a fall. "You are raising a weak daughter. Women must be strong, not emotional." His words insinuated themselves into me, making me doubt every maternal instinct. Was I doing everything wrong? Was I damaging my daughter with my too much love? Soon after, I discovered I was pregnant again. The news brought a wave of conflicting feelings. There was the profound joy for a new life, another small being to love and protect. But there was also a dull terror. Bringing another child into that cold house, under the dominion of that man, it seemed like an act of recklessness. A part of me, the most naive part that refused to die, hoped that a son might change things. Perhaps, I thought, an heir would appease his restlessness, would make him softer, more human. Kenneth received the news with contained satisfaction. "Good," he said, with a nod. "A boy will complete our family, a Moretti to carry on the name." His reaction spoke not of a child, but of an heir. Not of love, but of a dynasty. It was during my second pregnancy that Kenneth decided to definitively tighten the walls around me, severing the last, fragile thread that bound me to my old life, my sister Sandra. Sandra had always been my rock. Even though we rarely saw each other, her letters were small oases of normalcy. She told me about her life, her happy marriage to Donald, a good mechanic, her dreams of opening a small antique shop, and she asked about me, always with a veiled insistence of concern. "Are you okay, Lynn? You seem so tired in your letters. Are you happy?" I replied with vague, reassuring phrases, but she wasn't stupid. She could read between the lines of my too neat handwriting. One day, receiving no reply to 2 of her letters in a row, letters that Kenneth had intercepted and burned without telling me, she decided to come in person. She arrived one sunny afternoon, unannounced. It was a wonderful and terrifying surprise. Kenneth, by a strange coincidence, had returned home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Linda was playing on the rug. The sound of the doorbell made me jump. I went to open it and found my sister standing there. We hugged tightly, and for a moment, breathing in her familiar scent, I felt like the old Marilyn again. "Lynn, why haven't you answered? You made me worry," she said, stepping inside. Just then, Kenneth appeared in the doorway of the living room. His expression was a mask of impeccable courtesy. "Sandra, what a pleasant surprise," he said, his voice velvety. "Why didn't you let us know you were coming? We would have welcomed you properly." Sandra was slightly thrown off by his presence. "I wanted to surprise my sister, Kenneth. Sorry to intrude." "No intrusion at all. You're always welcome," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The next hour was an exercise in sublime tension. Kenneth was the perfect host. He offered Sandra a glass of iced tea, asked about her husband, her life. But every word he spoke was like a small pinprick. When Sandra told me I looked pale, Kenneth immediately intervened. "Marilyn overworks herself. She has too generous a heart. I always tell her to rest more, but she doesn't listen to me. Women sometimes are so stubborn." He managed to make my obvious exhaustion seem like my own fault, and my sister's concern feel like an intrusion. We talked for a while, but the atmosphere was strained. I replied in monosyllables, terrified of saying the wrong word. Sandra, sensing the chill, stood up to leave. At the door, she hugged me again and whispered in my ear, "If you need anything, anything at all, I'm here. Call me." I nodded, feeling the sting of tears. As soon as her figure disappeared down the street, Kenneth closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking was like a hammer blow. He turned to me. The mask of courtesy vanished, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "Well," he said softly, "now I understand." "Understand what, Kenneth?" I asked, my heart in my throat. "I understand why you've been so discontent lately. It's your sister. She puts strange ideas in your head. She comes here into my house to criticize how I treat you, to insinuate that I don't take good enough care of you." "But that's not true. She didn't say anything like that." "Oh, not with words, Marilyn," he said, moving closer, "but with glances, with her tone of voice. Do you think I'm stupid? I saw the way she looked at you, with pity. Your sister is jealous, that's the truth. She's always been jealous of you. She married a simple mechanic while you married a bank executive. She can't stand your happiness, and so she tries to destroy it, to make you believe you're unhappy." His words were a poison distilled with diabolical artistry. He took my fears, my insecurities, and used them to build a wall between me and the only person in the world who could have helped me. I was shaken. His logic was so twisted, yet so confident, that for a moment I doubted myself. Maybe he was right. Was Sandra's expression truly pity and not concern? The final masterful move came a week later. Donald, Sandra's husband, had applied for a small business loan at the bank to expand his auto repair shop. A loan that, under normal circumstances, would have been approved without issue. Kenneth came home that evening with a grave look. "I have bad news," he said at the dinner table. "I had to deny Donald's loan." I stared at him, shocked. "Why? Their business is doing well." He sighed, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "The numbers weren't entirely in order." "But it's not just that. After your sister's visit, after the things she insinuated, how could I, as a vice president, approve a loan to her husband? It would be a conflict of interest. People might think I was trying to buy their silence or that they were blackmailing me. Reputation, Marilyn, is everything. Your sister's loose tongue has damaged her own family." It was a masterstroke. I felt myself sinking. Not only had he isolated me, but he had made me feel guilty for the consequences. He had made me believe that my sister's long tongue had caused their financial ruin. That night, I wrote Sandra a brief, cold letter, dictated word for word by my broken heart and Kenneth's perverse logic, telling her that for everyone's sake, it was better if we didn't see each other for a while. It was like cutting off a limb. From that day on, the walls of my prison became solid stone. Our son Michael was born soon after, a beautiful, healthy baby boy with his father's serious eyes. Kenneth was immensely proud. He had his heir. But Michael's presence changed nothing. His education extended to both my children. Linda, my sensitive and dreamy daughter, was constantly reprimanded for her excessive imagination. Michael, conversely, was spurred on to be a man, to not cry, to be tough. Kenneth was shaping my children in his own image, and I watched, powerless. I tried to compensate with double the love, with stolen hugs and sweet words whispered when he wasn't around. But I felt I was fighting a losing battle. He was undermining my authority, positioning himself as the sole source of wisdom and strength. "Mom has a soft heart, but she doesn't understand how the world works," he would tell them. "Listen to Dad. Dad always knows what's right." The years passed, and I felt myself fading away. I had become an automaton, an empty shell performing its functions. My health began to suffer. I experienced terrible migraines and chronic stomach pains. My body was screaming the pain that my mouth could not express. I had reached the lowest point of my existence. I looked in the mirror and saw the eyes of a stranger, dull and filled with a fear that had become my second skin. It was on one of those dark days, after a sleepless night spent crying silently so as not to wake anyone, that I made a desperate decision. There was one last door to knock on. One last authority to appeal to, an authority I believed stood above any man. God and his representative on earth, Pastor Hayes. Our pastor was an elderly, kind man, loved by all, and he admired Kenneth deeply. I knew it would be difficult, but despair was stronger than fear. One afternoon, under a false pretense, I left the house and went to the church. It was empty and silent. I found Pastor Hayes in the vestry arranging the robes. When he saw me, he smiled. "Marilyn, my dear, what brings you here? Has something happened?" My courage nearly failed me. "Pastor," I stammered, "may I speak with you for a moment, in private?" His expression grew serious. He had me sit on an old wooden pew. The air smelled of incense and old wax. I was trembling so much that I had to clench my hands in my lap. I didn't know where to start. I couldn't just say, "My husband is a monster." It felt like blasphemy. "Pastor, I am not happy," I whispered. "There is a weight in my heart, an anguish that is killing me." "It's the burden of life, my child. We all carry it," he said gently. "No, it's different," I insisted, gathering courage. "It's my home. The air is heavy. I am afraid." "Afraid of what, Marilyn?" "I am afraid of my husband." The sentence came out as a breath, almost inaudible, but he heard it, and his reaction was the final blow. Pastor Hayes looked at me with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. He sighed, a tired, almost paternal sigh. "My child," he said, his tone changing, becoming condescending. "Perhaps you are just tired. 2 children, an important home to run. It's normal to feel overwhelmed. But fear? Fear of Kenneth? We are speaking of one of the most devout and generous men I have ever known. Just last week, he made a substantial donation to repair the church roof. He is a benefactor, an exemplary Christian." "But you don't see," I tried to say. "I see a young woman who is perhaps confusing the discipline of a good husband with cruelty," he interrupted me, with a firmness that allowed no retort. "Kenneth loves you, and sometimes love requires firmness for the good of the family. Your duty as a wife is to be a haven of peace for him, not a source of torment. Perhaps, instead of being afraid, you should be more grateful. Many women would want to be in your place." He stood up, a sign that the audience was over. "Now go home, Marilyn. Pray to the Lord. Ask him for the strength to be a better, more submissive wife. You will see that this anguish will pass." I left the vestry and crossed the deserted church like a ghost. The sunbeam filtering through the rose window seemed like a mockery. I had been judged and condemned. The last door had closed, slamming with a deafening echo. Not only would no one believe me, but the fault was mine. I was the one who wasn't grateful enough, submissive enough, good enough. I returned home. From the gate, I saw Kenneth in the backyard playing with Linda and Michael. He was laughing, tossing them in the air, the perfect image of a loving father. A passerby waved to him, and he responded with a cordial nod. The saint, the benefactor. I stopped to look at my reflection in the kitchen window glass. I saw the reflection of an emaciated woman, with dark circles under her eyes and an expression of absolute emptiness. I didn't recognize myself. In that moment, I understood. The walls of the prison were no longer around me. They were inside me. The whole world had become the warden of my cell, and I was the only one who knew I was a prisoner. Hope was no longer an option. Only survival remained. The years following my visit to the pastor settled upon my soul like layers of fine gray dust. Hope, even the smallest and most irrational kind, had died. In its place, a form of desolate peace had taken over. The peace of prisoners who stopped dreaming of escape and focus solely on daily survival. I learned to navigate my husband's silences like an experienced sailor navigates a treacherous sea. I knew how to recognize the invisible currents of his irritation, the storms announced by a slightly arched eyebrow or a clenched jaw. I became an expert in the art of emotional camouflage. My face was a serene mask, my words were measured, my gestures were calibrated not to produce the slightest friction. I existed, but I did not live. The house had become a perfectly managed stage. Kenneth continued his social ascent. He had joined the town council, his opinion was sought after, his presence was coveted. Our home hosted formal dinners, during which I moved like an efficient shadow, making sure the glasses were full and the conversation flowed, only to retreat when the men began talking about important matters. I had become exactly what he wanted, an impeccable accessory, silent and functional, who helped reinforce his image as a successful man with a perfect family behind him. My children grew up in this rarefied atmosphere. Linda, my sweet Linda, had become a teenager. She had blossomed into a delicate beauty, but her eyes carried a shadow of melancholy that broke my heart. She had absorbed the same lesson I had. In that house, to survive, one had to be silent and invisible. She was an obedient, studious girl, but her laughter was rare, her spirit caged. I saw in her the frightening reflection of the girl I had been, and I prayed every night that her destiny might be different from mine. Michael, on the other hand, was his father's masterpiece. He was a bright, self-assured boy, but his confidence bordered on arrogance. He idolized his father, mimicking his manners, his tone of voice. He had quickly learned that the way to gain Kenneth's approval was to appear strong, rational, and, at times, ruthless. He treated me with a kind of affectionate condescension, as if I were a sweet but somewhat simple-minded creature, incapable of understanding the complexities of the world. I felt my son drifting away from me, shaped by a clay that was not my own, and this was a dull, constant ache, one of the many small deaths I suffered every day. Yet, even in the most arid of deserts, sometimes a flower manages to sprout. And in our house, that flower was called James. James was the son of the local hardware store owner, a town boy with hands rough from work and clear, honest eyes. Linda and he had grown up together, but it was in that summer of her 16th year that their childhood friendship blossomed into something more tender and secret. I noticed it immediately. I saw a new sparkle in my daughter's eyes, a blush on her cheeks when James's name was mentioned, a new attention to the way she styled her hair. They began meeting in secret, brief conversations stolen on the way back from school, notes exchanged through a mutual friend. I, for the first time in years, chose to be an accomplice to a secret against my husband. I pretended not to see, covered for Linda's small absences, and became the silent guardian of that first, pure, innocent love. Seeing her happy, even if it was a clandestine happiness, was like feeling a ray of sunshine on my skin after an endless winter. That love was the only real thing, the only living thing in a house embalmed by pretense. It represented everything Kenneth despised: spontaneity, humility, a bond based on feeling, not calculation. And for that very reason, I knew it was destined to be discovered and destroyed. The discovery, indeed, was not long in coming. And it did not happen dramatically, but with the cold efficiency that characterized Kenneth's every action. One Saturday afternoon, we were at the table for lunch. The atmosphere was, as usual, formal. Kenneth was reading the newspaper while he ate. At one point, without lifting his gaze from the page, he said in a casual tone, "Linda, Mrs. Thompson mentioned seeing you talking for quite a while with old Mr. Davies's grandson near the old mill pond." The silence that fell was total. Linda paled, her fork frozen in midair. I felt a cold shiver down my spine. "James?" Linda asked, her voice a thread. "Ah, His name is James, Kenneth continued, slowly turning the page of the newspaper, as if the conversation was of little importance. Yes. She says you see each other often. Is that true? He's a friend, Linda whispered, her eyes lowered. A friend, Kenneth repeated, and this time he lowered the newspaper and stared at her. His gaze was not angry. It was worse. It was analytical, like that of an entomologist examining an insect. A friend whose family can barely afford their rent. A friend who, at nearly 20, still works in his grandfather's shop with no ambition whatsoever. A friend who has nothing to offer a girl like you. He is not a friend, Linda. He is a misjudgment, a pastime that ends today. But Dad, she tried, tears welling up. There is no but, he interrupted her, his voice hardening just slightly. The matter is closed. You will not see that boy again. You will not speak to him again. You will not even look at him. You will forget he exists. Your life, your future, are too important to be tainted by a stupid adolescent infatuation. You will marry a man of our standing, a man who can solidify the position I have worked so hard to build for this family. Is that clear? For the first time in her life, Linda dared to defy him. It's not fair, she exclaimed, her voice broken by sobs. I care about him. You can't decide who I love. Kenneth did not flinch. He rose slowly, folded his napkin, and placed it beside his plate. He approached his daughter, who was now openly sobbing. He did not touch her. He merely looked down at her. Love, he said with icy contempt, is a luxury for the poor and for poets. We are serious people, and you are a disappointment. Go to your room. I do not want to see your face again until you have stopped these childish displays. Linda fled, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Michael watched the entire scene with a confused expression, but also with a touch of admiration for his father's firmness. I remained seated, paralyzed. I saw my own story, my own youth, my own broken spirit repeating itself before my eyes. But this time, I was not the victim. It was my daughter. And in that moment, something inside me, something I thought had died and been buried for years, stirred. That evening, I waited until the house was immersed in silence. I waited to hear the regular breathing of my sleeping children. Then I went down to the living room where I knew I would find Kenneth in his study. He was sitting at his large walnut desk, rereading documents by the light of a lamp. I entered without knocking. He looked up, surprised and annoyed by my intrusion. What is it, Marilyn? It's late. I approached the desk, my hands clasped so he wouldn't see them trembling. Kenneth, we need to talk about Linda. He sighed, leaning back in his armchair. There's nothing to talk about. The decision is made. You can't do this, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. You can't destroy her happiness like this. She is just a girl. It is her first love. It's a pure, beautiful thing. Why do you want to crush it? He looked at me with a kind of amused pity. Marilyn, you are so hopelessly sentimental. You understand nothing of how the world works. The happiness you speak of is an illusion that fades. Position, respect, security, those are real. I am merely protecting my daughter from her own mistakes. You are imprisoning her, I said, my voice rising. You are turning her into me. The last sentence hung in the air, weighted with a significance neither of us could ignore. His face hardened. The mask of calm cracked, revealing the cold fury beneath. Be very careful what you say, he hissed. No, I replied, and I felt a wave of desperate courage wash over me. I won't be silent this time. This is about my daughter. You will not do to her what you did to me. You will not isolate her. You will not extinguish the light in her eyes. You will not turn her into an obedient shadow. I won't allow it. That was when he snapped. He shot up so quickly that his chair slammed against the bookcase. In 2 strides, he was in front of me. I hadn't realized how much taller and stronger he was. He seized my arms, his fingers digging into my flesh. He shoved me back until my spine hit the cold marble of the fireplace mantel. His face was inches from mine, his eyes 2 black pits of rage. "You won't allow it?" he snarled, his voice a terrifying whisper. "You? And who are you to allow or forbid anything in this house? You are nothing. You are my wife. Your only purpose is to obey. You and your daughter will do exactly as I say. For 20 years I have endured you. I have endured your mediocrity, your uselessness. And now you dare to challenge me?" The pain in my arms was intense. His breath smelled of wine and anger. Fear, my old familiar companion, clenched my throat. I felt my legs give way. I was about to cry, to beg, to return to the submissive Marilyn he knew. But then something strange happened. In that moment of absolute terror, I looked into his eyes, and for the first time, I did not see a powerful, invincible man. I saw a small, frightened man, frightened of losing control, frightened of being unmasked. His rage was not strength, it was weakness. And in that instant, the spell broke. The fear did not vanish, but it retreated to a corner of my mind. In its place, a cold calm arose, a crystalline clarity. I did not look away. I held his gaze, and I let him see that I was no longer terrified. I was something else. My silence, my stillness, confused him. He expected tears, pleas. Not finding them, his fury lost its grip. He loosened his hold, almost uncertainly. "Do you understand?" he asked, but his voice had lost its assurance. I didn't answer. I just stared at him. He, uncomfortable, regained his composure. He stepped away, adjusting his jacket. "The discussion is closed," he said, walking back toward the desk. "Linda will do as I have said." He was convinced he had won, that he had re-established his dominance. He couldn't know that, in reality, he had just lost everything. I remained leaning against the mantel for what seemed like an eternity, feeling the cold of the stone on my back. I was trembling, but it was no longer the tremor of fear. It was the vibration of a new, terrible energy awakening within me. I looked at my hands. For years, they had been hands that served, that cleaned, that cooked, that obeyed. Now, they felt different. They could become hands that fought. This will be the last time, I thought. The phrase was not a cry, but a silent oath, fire engraved on my soul. The last time he would lay a hand on me. The last time he would humiliate me or my children. The last time his will would crush ours. I didn't know how yet. I had no plan. But I knew with absolute certainty that the war had begun, and I would not fight it with his weapons. I would not use anger nor force. I would use cunning. I would use the patience he himself had taught me, and I would use his greatest weapon against him, his immaculate, precious reputation. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step lighter than the last. I felt empty, yet strangely full. I went to Linda's room. She was asleep, but her face was streaked with dry tears. I tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "Sleep, my love," I whispered. "Mom will fix everything." They were not empty words of comfort. They were a promise. I left her room, and before going to mine, I stopped in front of the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me was still pale and scared. But in her eyes, for the first time in 20 years, there was a spark. It was no longer the look of a victim. It was the look of a strategist who had just found her battlefield. Marilyn's long night was about to end, and the dawn, I knew, would be terrible. For him. The woman who came down for breakfast the morning after my terrible fight with Kenneth was not the same one who had been humiliated the night before. Outwardly, nothing had changed. I wore my usual apron. My hair was tied up in the same neat bun. But within me, a silent revolution had taken place. The old Marilyn, the frightened and resigned one, had died the previous night at the foot of that cold fireplace. In her place, a new creature was born, forged in fury and tempered by a cold, unwavering purpose. A creature my husband, in his arrogant blindness, would never be able to recognize. Kenneth was already at the table, engrossed in reading the newspaper. He did not look up when I entered. His silence was a punishment, a way of reaffirming his victory. In the past, that silence would have annihilated me, made me feel guilty, pushing me toward humiliating apologies. But that morning, I welcomed it as an ally. His contempt was the shield behind which I could hide my transformation. I served his coffee, placing the cup beside him with a fluid, tranquil movement. Then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I spoke first. "You are right, Kenneth," I said, my voice a whisper of absolute submission. He lowered the newspaper, surprised. "About Linda. I was tired last night. I spoke without thinking. You know what is best for her, for our family. I am sorry I doubted you." I saw him relax. A small smile of triumph crinkled his lips. "I see the night brought counsel," he said condescendingly. "It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you understand your place." He returned to his reading, the matter filed away. He had swallowed the bait. My performance had begun, and it would be the longest and most difficult of my life. In the days and weeks that followed, I transformed myself into the wife he had always dreamed of. I erased myself with an almost artistic dedication. I anticipated his every desire, prepared his favorite dishes without his having to ask, and ensured the house was a sanctuary of order and peace. I stopped expressing opinions. I nodded at his political monologues, listened to his successes at the bank with an air of devout admiration. I became a mirror that reflected only his greatness. With my children, the change was more subtle. I continued to be a loving mother, but I began to verbally reinforce their father's authority. "Dad has worked so hard to give us all of this," I told Linda, while brushing her hair. "His only wish is for our happiness, even if sometimes we don't understand it." I saw the confusion in her eyes, but my new, unwavering calm reassured her. Even Michael, who usually treated me with condescension, seemed to appreciate this new version of me, which was more aligned with his father's worldview. Kenneth was pleased. He was convinced he had finally broken me, that he had rooted out the last, annoying weeds of my will. This conviction of his became my greatest asset. His arrogance was the cloak of invisibility under which I could weave my web. But a plan, however determined, needs weapons. And I needed to find a weapon powerful enough to destroy a man like my husband. I knew I couldn't fight him on his territory. I didn't have his power, his influence, his wealth. But he had a weakness, an Achilles heel that was also his greatest strength: his reputation, his public image as an honest, devout, and generous man. If I could manage to crack that, to show the world the true face behind the mask, I would destroy him. To do that, I needed proof. Something concrete, something unassailable, and I knew exactly where to look. Kenneth's study was his sanctuary, the heart of his power, a severe room, paneled in dark wood, dominated by a massive desk. In there, he wasn't just my husband, he was Executive Kenneth Moretti. The room was always locked when he wasn't in it, but I, over the course of 20 years, had learned every secret of that house. I knew he kept a spare key to the study, in a small hidden drawer behind a false panel in the hallway bookcase. A hiding place he himself had shown me years ago, in a rare moment of misplaced trust, saying, "In case something serious were to happen." He never imagined that the most serious thing that could happen was me. My plan required sleepless nights and a courage I didn't know I possessed. I waited until the entire house was steeped in deep sleep. I waited to hear Kenneth's heavy, regular breathing beside me, a sound that for years had terrified me and that now served as my all-clear signal. Then I would slip out of bed with slow movements, holding my breath at every minimal creak of the floorboards. I would reach the bookcase, open the secret panel, and take the key. The small, cold piece of metal in my hand felt immensely heavy. The first time I entered his study at night, my heart was pounding so hard I feared it might wake the entire house. The air was impregnated with his smell, leather, tobacco, and cologne. It was like entering the wolf's den. I lit a small candle, shielding the flame with my hand, and began my search. I knew what I was looking for. A large ledger bound in black leather. I had seen it on his desk sometimes. It was there that he meticulously annotated not only the official bank accounts, but also his private dealings, personal loans, under-the-table agreements. I found the book in a lower desk drawer, locked, another obstacle. For days, I observed his movements. I noticed he always carried a set of small keys with him, including the one for the drawer. Stealing it was impossible. I decided to resort to an old trick I had seen my father use in the print shop for custom lockets. One evening, while Kenneth was in the shower, I went into the study under the pretext of dusting. I took a small, damp piece of soap from the kitchen and with trembling hands pressed the drawer lock against the soap, creating a crude but sufficiently clear mold. It was an operation of a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The next step was the most dangerous. I had to find a locksmith, but I couldn't go to anyone in town. That would be like putting an advertisement in the local paper. I remembered an old craftsman in the next town over, the one where my sister lived, an elderly, almost blind man who, it was rumored, could replicate any key just by feeling it. I invented a plausible excuse. I told Kenneth that an old aunt of mine, who lived in that very town, was ill and that I wished to visit her. My recent submission paid off. Kenneth consented, almost benevolently. "Good girl," he said. "I see you are finally understanding the priorities. Take the day, but don't be late." That bus trip was a mixture of terror and euphoria. Every mile that took me away from my town was a step toward a possible freedom. I found the locksmith's shop, a dark little hole smelling of dust and metal. The elderly craftsman, hunched over his grinding wheel, examined my soap mold with fingers like dry branches. "A German lock," he mumbled. "Sturdy. It will take a while." I returned after an hour, and he handed me a small iron key. I paid with the few dollars I had been secretly saving for months, hiding change from the grocery money. That key was the key to my hope. But before using it, there was another door I had to open, a much more difficult and painful one. The door to my sister's heart. I didn't visit any aunt. I went straight to Sandra's house. When she saw me on the doorstep, her expression was a mixture of shock and coldness. Years of silence and my cruel letter had carved a deep furrow between us. She let me in, but her gestures were rigid. "What are you doing here, Marilyn?" she asked, without inviting me to sit. The tears I had held back for years threatened to overflow. "Sandra, please, I need to talk to you. I need your help." "My help?" she said, with a bitterness that pierced me. "You haven't needed me for years. Not when I lost the baby, not when Donald's business was failing. Where were you, Lynn?" She was right. Her accusation was fair and deserved. I collapsed. I fell to my knees on her kitchen floor and wept. I wept for the lost years, for my cowardice, for my loneliness. I told her everything, every humiliation, every sharp word, every night of terror, the incident with my arm, the visit to the pastor. I poured 20 years of pain and silence onto her. Sandra remained motionless, listening. Little by little, her coldness melted, replaced by an expression of horror and disbelief. When I finished speaking, she knelt beside me and hugged me. And we wept together, two sisters reunited in the shipwreck of a life. "Oh, Lynn, forgive me," she sobbed. "I didn't understand. I just thought you had become proud, that you were ashamed of us." "No," I said, my voice broken. "I was just afraid, but not anymore. Now I want to fight, Sandy, and I need you." I showed her the key. I explained my still vague plan to find proof in Kenneth's ledger. Sandra's face hardened, her sadness turning into a cold anger. "That monster," she hissed. "He ruined us too. The loan. Now I understand. He did it on purpose to isolate you." Donald, her husband, who had entered silently, had heard the last part. He approached, his honest face contorted with rage. "We will help you," he said, with a simplicity that was worth 1,000 oaths. "Just tell us what we need to do." That day marked the birth of a conspiracy. I was no longer alone. I had allies. Back home, I felt stronger. That very night, I put the second phase of my plan into action. I went down to the study, this time with the right key. The drawer opened with a small click, and there, under a pile of official bank documents, it was, the black leather ledger. I took it to the kitchen, the humblest and least suspicious place in the house, and I began to read it by the faint light of a candle. The first pages were ordinary accounts, figures I didn't understand, but gradually I began to decipher Kenneth's system. Beside the official loans, there were notations in pencil, almost invisible, names, dates, and small codes. I realized they were the personal loans, the ones made without bank collateral, at exorbitant interest rates. They were mousetraps. For weeks, every night, I dedicated myself to studying that book. It became my obsession. With Donald's help, who provided me with an old notebook from his shop, I began to copy the most compromising information. My hands, accustomed to kneading dough and folding paper, learned to decipher the secrets of a loan shark. And what I discovered was chilling. There was the name of Mr. Davies, the hardware store owner, James's grandfather. He had asked for a small loan to buy new inventory, and now he was paying an interest rate that was strangling him. There was the name of Mrs. Perkins, an elderly widow who had lost her husband's life insurance payout due to a bad investment. Kenneth's generous loan was going to cause her to lose her entire home within a year. And there were dozens of other names, small shopkeepers, merchants, desperate families. Kenneth was not a benefactor. He was a vulture, a spider weaving his web by taking advantage of others' misfortune, only to collect at an exorbitant price, often in exchange for favors, information, or subjugation. My nights were populated by these names, by these stories of silent desperation. And my determination grew. I was no longer fighting just for myself and my daughter. I was fighting for all those people, for the entire town he held in his grip with his false benevolence. The problem now was how to use this information. Could I go to the police? No. My word against that of the powerful executive Moretti was worth nothing, and the book, if I stole it, would be illegally obtained evidence. I had to find a way to make his house of cards collapse in public, in a way so spectacular that it would leave no doubt. The opportunity, like a ripe fruit, fell into my lap a couple of months later. One day, Kenneth came home beaming, with an euphoria I hadn't seen in years. He was waving a letter with the town seal. "You won't believe it, Marilyn," he announced. "The town committee has decided to name me Citizen of the Year. There will be a huge ceremony in the square in a month. Even the state senator will be there." As he spoke, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't fear. It was the sensation of a hunter seeing the prey voluntarily enter her trap. A public ceremony, the square full, the authorities present. I could never have hoped for a better stage. The platform he had built to celebrate his glory would become the theater of his ruin. That same evening, I sent a message to Sandra. The next day, under the pretext of a dental appointment in the city, I took the bus again. The meeting took place in Donald's workshop, amidst the smell of sawdust and glue. It was the three of us, three conspirators united by a common goal. "I found the way," I said, and I explained the ceremony to them. Donald and Sandra listened in silence. I saw fear in their eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. "It's risky, Lynn," Donald said. "Those people are terrified of him." "I know," I replied. "But fear can be overcome by desperation. And I have proof of their desperation." I pulled out the pages I had copied from the ledger. "We need to talk to them, one by one, in secret. We have to convince them that if they all speak together, he can't touch them. Their strength will be in their numbers." It was a long and dangerous task. In the following weeks, using my rare outings and the help of Donald and Sandra as intermediaries, we contacted Kenneth's victims. At first, we met a wall of terror. No one wanted to expose themselves, but then we showed them the copies of the ledger. They saw their names next to those of their neighbors, their friends. They understood they were not alone in the trap. Slowly, painstakingly, the fear began to turn into anger. The plan took shape. There would be no violent protest. It would be a silent, orderly ambush. During the ceremony, at the culminating moment, after Kenneth's speech, one person would rise. And then another. And another. Each with a simple, precise question about their debt, their land, their shop. The night before the ceremony, the house was immersed in an unreal calm. I had prepared Kenneth's favorite dinner, pot roast with mashed potatoes. I had ironed his best shirt. He was in excellent spirits, savoring his triumph. He rehearsed his speech aloud, a text full of words like community, sacrifice, trust. I listened, nodding at the right moments, my heart beating a savage rhythm against my ribs. "You'll be proud of me tomorrow, won't you, Marilyn?" he asked, placing a hand on my shoulder. I looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time in a long time, my smile was not entirely false. "Yes, Kenneth," I replied, my voice a whisper. "Tomorrow, finally, you will get exactly what you deserve." He interpreted my words as an act of devotion. He couldn't know they were a condemnation. The trap was set. The silent plan was ready to explode, and I, his prisoner, had become his executioner. This night, as I look back, I remember that chilling certainty. I was ready to risk everything for the freedom I hadn't even dared to name before. The life I lived was not a life, and for the sake of Linda and Michael, I would tear down the foundation of the man who had built my cage. And I ask myself, now that I have laid bare the first steps of my strategy, have you ever had to hide a great strength behind a great silence? Tell me in the comments, how did you find the patience to wait for your moment? The morning of the ceremony, I woke up before dawn. The house was steeped in a deep silence, a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath before a storm. I rose from the bed with infinite slowness, careful not to wake Kenneth. For the first time in so many years, his heavy breathing beside me did not inspire terror, but a strange, cold pity. He slept the unaware sleep of the condemned, dreaming of the laurels of victory while I, his humble servant, was sharpening the blade of his ruin. I went to the kitchen and prepared coffee. Routine, the usual gestures, were my anchor in a sea of fear and expectation. Every movement was deliberate, almost sacred. Grinding the beans, pouring the water, waiting for the mocha pot to bubble. In that normality, I found the strength not to crumble. I looked out the window. The dawn painted the sky above the hills in rose and orange. It seemed like any other day, yet I knew this day would change everything. It would either free me or annihilate me forever. There was no middle ground. A wave of panic gripped my stomach. What if something went wrong? What if the people were too afraid? What if Kenneth, with his cunning, managed to turn the situation to his favor. My mind was a vortex of doubts. I leaned against the sink, breathing deeply. Then, my gaze fell upon a small, childlike drawing taped to the cupboard with a magnet. It was a crooked portrait of me, drawn by Linda years before. "My mommy" was written beneath it, in shaky handwriting. That image, that memory of pure love, was my strength. I wasn't doing this out of hatred for him. I was doing it out of love for her, for the sake of the future she deserved, a future free from his shadow. When Kenneth came downstairs, I was the perfect image of calm. Breakfast was ready, the newspaper neatly folded beside his cup. He was in excellent spirits, almost euphoric. He whistled as he shaved, rehearsing the knot of the tie I had chosen for him in the mirror. He was so engrossed in his own greatness that he was utterly oblivious to my transformation. He saw only the submissive wife finally cured of her silly anxieties. "It will be a great day, Marilyn," he said, giving me a distracted kiss on the forehead. A gesture so rare it made me shiver. "The whole town will be there. The senator, the selectmen. It's important that you and the children are impeccable. You are my calling card." "We will be perfect," I replied, my voice a whisper. I spent the morning preparing my children as if they were to be presented to royalty. I put Linda in her best dress, the blue one that brought out the color of her eyes. She was silent, oppressed by a sadness she didn't dare show. I adjusted a ribbon in her hair. Our eyes met in the mirror. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible wink. She didn't understand, but a faint smile crinkled her lips for an instant. It was a secret message between the two of us. Have faith. With Michael, it was harder. At 16, he was his father's shadow. He wore his first serious suit, stiff and proud. "Today, everyone will understand what kind of family we are," he said, with an almost comical seriousness. "We are the Morettis." I merely smiled at him, feeling a pang in my heart. His father's fall would also be his. And that was one of the most painful consequences of my plan, a price I knew I had to pay. As the hour approached, the air in the house became electric. I felt like a soldier before battle. Every gesture was amplified, every sound was deafening. The ticking of the clock marked the countdown. When we finally left the house, the sun was high in the sky. The town was celebrating. Tricolor flags waved from balconies. The band practiced its brass instruments in a corner of the square. It looked like a town festival, but for me, it was an arena, an open-air courtroom. The square was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Everyone in town was there, from the farmers in their Sunday best to the merchants and the ladies in their best hats. A stage, adorned with red drapes, had been set up on the church steps. Upon it sat the authorities, Mr. Peterson, the town selectman in his official sash, the police chief in his uniform, and in the center, Pastor Hayes, a towering figure in his dark suit. Kenneth pushed his way through the crowd, which parted before him like the waters of the Red Sea. He shook hands, dispensed smiles, and accepted compliments. I followed him, a step behind as always, holding the children by the hand. We found our seats in the reserved first row. My heart was a small, frantic beast in my ribcage. I searched the crowd for my allies. I saw Donald and Sandra standing on the side of the square. Sandra looked at me, and in her eyes I read all her fear and her determination. We exchanged an infinitesimal nod. Then I saw the others. Old Mr. Davies, the hardware store owner, his face hardened like the metal he worked. Mrs. Perkins, the widow, twisting her handkerchief in her hands, and dozens of others. They were scattered throughout the crowd, small points of silent anger in a sea of unsuspecting celebration. They were ready. The ceremony began. The selectman, a pompous man, gave an interminable speech, praising Kenneth as a beacon of integrity and progress for our beloved community. Then Pastor Hayes spoke. His deep, resonant voice extolled Kenneth's Christian charity, his generosity toward the neediest, citing the recent donation for the church roof. Every word of praise was a nail driven into my flesh, but also a brick that made his imminent fall even higher and more ruinous. Finally, his moment arrived. Kenneth rose and headed for the microphone. The square erupted in thunderous applause. He cleared his throat, waited for the silence to fall again, and began to speak. His speech was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. He spoke of humble origins, even though he had never had them. He spoke of hard work, of sacrifice. He spoke of trust as the most precious commodity in a community. Trust, he said, his voice broken by feigned emotion, is a fragile crystal. Once broken, it can never be repaired, and I have dedicated my life to being a man worthy of your trust. Then he made the move I knew he would. He turned toward me, searching for my gaze. But I could not be the man I am without my family, without my wonderful children, Linda and Michael, and above all, without the support, the patience, and the silent love of my incomparable wife, Marilyn. The crowd turned toward me again. The applause flared up louder than before. I stood up as rehearsed. I smiled, a smile that cost me every ounce of strength I had. I applauded too, slowly, and in that moment our eyes met, and he saw, or perhaps thought he saw, tears of emotion in my eyes. They were tears, yes, but not of pride. They were tears of farewell. He returned to his seat. The selectmen approached, holding the gold medal on a velvet cushion. This was the moment. The trap was about to spring. My heart stopped beating. The selectmen raised the medal. And now, with immense honor, I name Kenneth Moretti Citizen of the Year. The applause burst forth, deafening. The band struck up a fanfare. In that noise, I thought for a terrible instant that our plan had failed, that the voices of our allies would be drowned out. But then, as the applause began to subside, a voice rose from the crowd, an elderly voice, trembling yet clear. "Mr. Moretti!" A perplexed silence fell upon the square. Everyone turned around. It was old Mr. Davies. He had made his way through the people and now stood in the middle of the square, his sun-hardened face turned toward the stage. The selectman, annoyed, moved to intervene, but Kenneth stopped him with a magnanimous gesture. "Allow me, selectman," he said into the microphone. "It's Mr. Davies, a dear citizen. Please, good man, speak your mind." He was convinced he could handle the situation, turning it into another example of his benevolence. "Mr. Moretti," Davies continued, his voice gaining strength, "you speak of trust. I gave you my trust last year when I needed inventory for my shop. You gave me a loan. A loan that is now going to cost me the shop my father worked his whole life to build. Can you please explain to everyone why the interest you are charging me is triple the bank's rate?" A murmur snaked through the crowd. Kenneth lost his smile. "My dear Davies," he said, with a tone of feigned patience, "this is not the appropriate venue to discuss private matters. We will talk in my office, as always." But it was too late. Another voice rose from another part of the square. "I have a question too, Mr. Moretti." It was Mrs. Perkins, the widow. She stepped forward, holding a sheet of paper in her hand, the copy we had given her. "Here it says that my loan to cover my late husband's medical bills has administrative expenses that are higher than the loan itself. Can you explain what these expenses are?" And then it was as if a dam had broken. Another man stood up. "My family farm. Why did you demand ownership of my land as collateral for such a small sum?" Another. And still another. "My savings. My retirement." The voices overlapped, a desperate chorus of people who had suffered in silence for years and who now, seeing they were not alone, found the courage to speak. The square, once festive, had become a courtroom. Confusion turned into anger as people began to understand. The copies of the ledger passed from hand to hand, irrefutable proof of his greed. The authorities on the stage were frozen stiff. Pastor Hayes stood up, his face a mask of outrage. The selectman stammered, trying to restore order, but no one listened to him. In the midst of that chaos, Kenneth's gaze, now stripped of all pretense, sought mine. It was a look of pure, distilled hatred. His eyes pierced me, and in them I saw the flash of comprehension. He understood. He understood that the architect of that perfect ruin, the only person who knew his secrets well enough to orchestrate it, was me, his silent, submissive, useless wife. I did not look away. I held his gaze, without hatred, without triumph, only with an immense calm, the calm of long-awaited justice. And in that silent exchange of glances, his mask did not crack. It shattered. It dissolved into 1,000 pieces, revealing the small, greedy, and cruel man he had always been. The crowd, finally seeing his true nature in the panic and fury that contorted his face, began to shout, "Thief! Loan shark! Traitor!" The ceremony was over. His life, as he had known it, was over. The consequences were swift and total. Kenneth did not go to prison. In those days, these crimes were difficult to prove legally, and the paper trail was messy. But his sentence was perhaps worse: social death. The bank fired him immediately. The town council revoked his honorary titles. The people who had once bowed to him now crossed the street to avoid him. No one spoke to him anymore. In a small community like ours, that was a capital sentence. A week later, he packed his bags and left in the dead of night, like a thief. I never saw him again. My life afterward did not become a fairy tale. There were financial difficulties. There was the weight of gossip, the shame that fell on my children. Michael, in particular, took years to forgive me for destroying the idol he worshipped. It was a long, difficult path, made up of small steps. But for the first time, I was free. The house, once cold and silent, was filled with life again. My sister Sandra and her husband Donald became a constant presence. We opened the windows, let in the light and the air. Linda, freed from her condemnation, was finally able to live her love with James, and their marriage, celebrated a year later, was a simple celebration, but filled with a joy I never thought possible. Slowly, with the help of my family and the few true friends who remained, I rebuilt my life. A normal life made of work, of sacrifices, but also of sincere laughter, of hugs, of freedom. The freedom to simply be Marilyn. Today, at 84, when I look back at that day in the square, I don't feel pride nor revenge. I feel a deep gratitude for the frightened girl I was, for finding at the bottom of her despair the strength to fight. I didn't commit a heroic act. I simply reclaimed my right to exist, and that perhaps is the most important battle any of us can ever win. I remember standing in the kitchen right after Kenneth left, running my hand across the spot where Linda's little drawing used to be. The magnet was still there, but the paper was gone, packed away by Linda as she finally prepared for a future of her own making. And I realized that the end of my story was just the beginning of theirs, a beginning that needed me to step fully into my own truth. The silence after Kenneth left was not the cold, heavy quiet of his control. It was the echoing space of a vast, bewildering new freedom. He had vanished into the pre-dawn hours of a Tuesday, taking only 2 suitcases and leaving behind a shattered reputation and a house that felt suddenly too large, too empty. But liberation is not a fairy tale ending. It is a beginning, forged in chaos. My first feeling was not triumph, but an overwhelming, paralyzing exhaustion. For 20 years, every action had been a calculated defense against his authority. Now, the adversary was gone, and I didn't know how to move without anticipating his reaction. The immediate aftermath was brutal. The town, which had so quickly turned on Kenneth, now turned its gaze onto the Moretti family. We were no longer the image of success, we were the object of scandal. The beautiful colonial house became a symbol of deceit, and the whispers, always sharp in a small community, followed us everywhere. The bank, as expected, was swift. The paperwork showed Kenneth had been careful. The personal loans were separate from the official books, but the evidence of his usury was enough to terminate his employment and blacklist him in New England banking circles. The house, registered solely in his name, became a liability. The legal process was long and costly, draining the small amount of savings I had hidden away over the years. I had to face lawyers who spoke a language as cold and complex as Kenneth's rules, struggling to secure a portion of the assets to keep the roof over our heads. I knew I had to work. The money from my father's stationery shop was long gone, invested in Kenneth's secure portfolio. I had been isolated for so long that my professional skills were rusty, but necessity strips away shame. I swallowed my pride, and with Sandra's staunch support, I started taking in tailoring work, using the sewing machine my mother had given me years ago. It wasn't glorious. It was long hours of meticulous labor, mending hems and adjusting seams for the very same women who whispered about me at the grocery store. It was the humblest of beginnings, but the money I earned, every single dollar, was clean and mine. It was the tangible proof that I could stand on my own. Sandra and Donald were my lifeline. They came over every evening after Donald closed his shop, bringing casseroles and a loud, comforting normality that pierced the suffocating silence of our perfect house. Sandra, whose trust I had so cruelly severed, now offered her help without a single word of reproach. Her love was fiercely practical. She helped me with the paperwork, managed the household accounts, and most importantly, taught me how to put up a shield against the town's judgment. "Let them talk, Lynn," she'd say, scrubbing the kitchen floor with a ferocious energy. "Their words can't take away the freedom you bought for your kids. This house is ours now, not his stage." Linda was my strength. She was 18 and on the cusp of true adulthood, and the unmasking of her father had, paradoxically, set her free immediately. The shadow he cast over her life lifted, revealing the vibrant, intelligent young woman I had always hoped she would be. She was the first to take down the last vestiges of his life. She boxed up his reading chair, filed away his meticulously labeled papers, and insisted on painting the somber dark wood of his study a cheerful, light yellow. Her relationship with James blossomed into a steady, loving bond. James, whose family had been hurt by Kenneth's predatory lending, showed remarkable maturity. He didn't see me as the scandal's wife. He saw the woman who had fought for her children. Their love was a visible, living protest against Kenneth's cynicism, a beautiful, genuine thing that proved his belief in calculated marriages was fundamentally wrong. Seeing them together, planning their simple future, Linda wanted to go to nursing school. James planned to take over his grandfather's hardware shop, was my greatest reward. But the most difficult part of the rebuilding was Michael. At 16, Michael was living a profound, agonizing trauma. His father was not just a parent, he was an idol. Kenneth had meticulously cultivated Michael's respect, shaping him to be the man of the family, praising his cold logic and discouraging any sign of softness. When the truth exploded in the town square, Michael's foundation crumbled. His father's fall was a personal humiliation, a profound betrayal that he wasn't emotionally equipped to handle. He withdrew immediately. He stopped going to school, claiming he was sick. He spent hours locked in his room, surrounded by silence. When he did speak, it was laced with a chilling, self-righteous anger. "He's still my father, Mom," Michael finally burst out one evening, his voice tight with pain, when I tried to ask him about his day. "You destroyed him. You humiliated him in front of the whole town. You lied, Mom. You smiled at him, and then you stabbed him in the back." His words were a physical blow. He didn't see a woman who fought for survival. He saw a deceitful villainess who had engineered the ruin of his hero. I tried to explain the years of abuse, the isolation, the fear. I told him about the bruises on my arm, the emotional warfare, the way Kenneth was turning him and Linda into tools for his ambition. He was strict, but he was right about things, Michael retorted, his voice rising to a shout. He said you were weak and too emotional. Look at you now. You're broke, the town hates us, and the man who was going to send me to Princeton is gone. You ruined my future for some stupid, cheap romance between Linda and that mechanic's boy. The sheer force of Kenneth's twisted logic, still living and breathing inside my son, terrified me. I saw in Michael's eyes the same cold contempt his father had mastered. He was a perfect casualty of emotional abuse, poisoned against the very person who had saved him. I knew I couldn't fight him with logic or emotion. The shame and loyalty he felt were too raw. I had to employ the same patience I had used to defeat his father. You have every right to be angry, Michael, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I know this is hard, but your father chose his path. I only chose to live. When you are ready to see the difference, I will be here. I love you, and that will never change. He slammed his bedroom door, and I spent the rest of the night weeping silently on the hallway floor. The cost of my freedom was his alienation. The town's judgment wasn't just on Kenneth's crimes. It was a deeper cultural condemnation of my actions. Many people, particularly the men and some of the older women, viewed my actions not as a righteous move against abuse, but as a treacherous act against the sanctity of marriage and a husband's authority. I overheard a conversation one afternoon at the market, a painful echo of Pastor Hayes's old words. She should have been more submissive, an older woman remarked. A good wife supports her husband, even through his faults. Now look what she's done, broken up the family for her own pride. This external pressure, coupled with Michael's profound rejection, created an atmosphere of constant tension and doubt. There were days when the temptation to pack up and move away, to escape the judgment, was almost irresistible. But I remembered the years I spent confined, and I refused to flee. I had earned my place in this town, in this life, and I would not give it up. I would stay and live cleanly, forcing them all to witness the slow, painful truth of my integrity. My quiet resilience began to change the narrative, one small interaction at a time. The first small victory came through Mrs. Perkins, the widow whose home Kenneth had nearly taken. She had found a way to save her house after the scandal exposed Kenneth's fraud. One day, she came to my door, not to order a dress, but with a simple loaf of bread. "Thank you, Marilyn," she said, her voice trembling, "for what you did, not just for me, but for all of us. He had us all so scared." She didn't stay long, but that small loaf of bread was warmer and sweeter than any award Kenneth had ever received. Slowly, other victims began to acknowledge me. Not with fanfare, but with a respectful nod, an extra word of kindness at the store, or a small business referral. They were the ones who truly understood the depth of the courage it took to stand up to that kind of power. They were my true community, forged in shared suffering and silent gratitude. The house, once a fortress of rules, became a home of compromise and open windows. Linda and I made a pact. No more secrets, no more silence. We talked about everything, rebuilding a mother-daughter bond that had been strained by years of emotional guarding. We learned to laugh again, a genuine, loud laughter that filled the rooms. But Michael's silence remained. He moved through the house like a ghost, eating his meals alone, answering questions with curt, cold indifference. I knew I couldn't push him. The process of disillusionment had to come from within. I had destroyed his idol, and I had to wait for him to find the man behind the gilded mask himself. My life was now built on a foundation of grit and exhaustion. I was the tailor, the cook, the cleaner, the struggling head of household, but I was the master of my own minutes. I had exchanged a gilded cage for a difficult, strenuous, and utterly authentic freedom. The greatest challenge ahead was not financial. It was to keep Michael from becoming the very thing I had fought so hard to escape, a person defined by Kenneth's cold, calculating worldview. I often looked at his face, seeing his father's features, and prayed that the true, good boy I knew was still hidden somewhere beneath that armor of resentment. His reconciliation would be the true end of Kenneth's power over us. I knew that Michael's healing would require a catalyst, a moment that would shatter the last of his father's lies. I didn't know what it would be or when it would come, but I waited with the same cold patience that had allowed me to copy the ledger. I had fought one war, and now I waited for the final, most personal battle to begin. The stability of our new life was deceptive. On the surface, the Moretti family was functioning. I was earning a steady, if modest, income. Linda was preparing for nursing school, her eyes full of the future she was building with James, and the constant, judgmental hum of the town had begun to fade into background noise. But the central fissure remained, the silence of Michael. He was 18 now, tall and guarded, having graduated high school with minimal effort and no ambition, a direct refusal to engage with the world Kenneth had promised him. He still lived at home, contributing nothing, his presence a perpetual cold void. He moved between his room and the kitchen, avoiding my gaze, treating me with the practiced, distant politeness of a hotel clerk. I knew that time alone wouldn't heal him. The process of dismantling a foundational lie that his father was a powerful, righteous man required an internal earthquake. I couldn't force it, but I could, and did, remain steadfastly present, a constant, loving anchor he couldn't entirely ignore. The catalyst came on a chilly autumn evening, almost 2 years after Kenneth's sudden departure. Linda and James were out, and the house was heavy with the familiar, suffocating atmosphere of Michael's resentment. I was in the living room, mending a delicate silk dress for one of my former society acquaintances, a small irony I no longer felt, when the sound of a heavy object hitting the floor came from Kenneth's old study, now the sewing room. I went to the door and found Michael standing amidst a scatter of objects. He had been rummaging through a box of his father's old possessions that I had stored away, relics of his former life that Michael occasionally sought out, perhaps hoping to find the proof that my testimony had been the real lie. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He was holding a small, leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a look I hadn't seen in years, confusion, not contempt. "Nothing," he muttered, quickly trying to put the diary away. "Michael, what did you find?" I took a step closer. He didn't move, but his hand tightened around the book. "I found this. It's nothing." "Let me see it." A brief, fierce struggle ensued. He held the diary tight, and for a moment I saw the ghost of his father's resistance in his jaw. But I wasn't the frightened wife anymore. My strength was quiet, fueled by 2 decades of suppressed fury. I gently but firmly pried the book from his grasp. I looked down at the small diary. The initials KM were embossed on the front. It wasn't the ledger. It was something far older, far more personal. I opened it to a random page. The handwriting was Kenneth's, small, cramped, meticulous. "This is from when he was in college," I explained, scanning a date from the late 1940s. "Before we met." Michael backed away, suddenly looking ashamed and vulnerable. "Just throw it away, I don't care." I ignored him. I sat down on the floor, amidst the scattered papers, and began to read aloud, following a passage that detailed his early years of ambition. It wasn't a document of usury. It was a testament to his emptiness. Kenneth wrote not of dreams, but of metrics. He detailed his plan to marry well, choosing a woman who would be easily managed and whose family would provide a clean start. He wrote about his strategy to acquire respect through calculated generosity. And then I found the entry that broke the last of Michael's armor. It was an entry about my father, my sweet, honest father, the stationery shop owner. "The old man is easy," Kenneth had written, years before our marriage. "He sees a bank executive and thinks, success. He's a simpleton. His shop is small, but his connections in the town are deep. Marrying his daughter Marilyn will give me immediate, unearned goodwill. The girl is unremarkable, but compliant. The perfect ornament for an aspiring man." I read the words slowly, my voice trembling only slightly on the final, cruel phrase, "the perfect ornament." A deep, wrenching sob tore from Michael's throat. He fell to his knees beside me, his entire body shaking. He wasn't crying for the loss of his father, but for the loss of a lie. He had believed in his father's genuine respect for my family. He had believed his father's success was rooted in true integrity. Now, he saw the meticulous calculation behind every polite handshake, every gesture of respect, stretching back to before I was even his mother. "He never loved you," Michael choked out, his face buried in his hands. "He never loved any of us. We were pieces on a board." "He was afraid," I corrected him, dropping the diary. The feeling of hatred I carried for Kenneth had vanished years ago, replaced by a cold, clinical indifference. "He was so afraid of being small, Michael, that he had to make everyone else small to feel big. That wasn't strength. It was the deepest kind of weakness." The confrontation with Michael lasted through the night. I didn't push him to apologize. I simply let him grieve the destruction of his lifelong idol. I told him every truth I had kept hidden, not as accusations, but as facts of survival. I told him about the fear, the isolation, and the reason I stayed, for him and for Linda. As the sun began to rise, bathing the sewing room in a soft orange light, Michael finally looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. "Why did you stay with him for so long, Mom?" "Because of a phrase Pastor Hayes once told me," I admitted, a bitter smile on my lips. "He told me my duty was to be submissive, to be a haven of peace for my husband. I didn't realize until much later that the true haven wasn't for him, but for you and Linda. I stayed to be a shield, to teach you how to feel love, even when he taught you only ambition. I had to wait until I was strong enough to break the bars without destroying the cage." His long journey of healing began that morning. He finally saw me not as a weak, deceitful woman, but as a strategist who had fought a war of silence to save her children. The resentment was replaced by a deep, heartbreaking empathy. He finally understood the cost of my freedom. Michael, once the proud, cold shadow of his father, became a quiet, sensitive young man. He apologized to me, to Linda, and to James, and the genuine contrition in his voice was the last nail in Kenneth's coffin. He re-enrolled in night classes, choosing to study carpentry and mechanics, honest trades that spoke of integrity and genuine hard work, a world away from the dishonest finance that had defined his father. My story didn't end with a grand triumph, but with a quiet, hard-earned peace. Linda and James married the following summer. It was a small ceremony in Sandra and Donald's yard, filled with genuine warmth, simple food, and the laughter of true friends, the victims Kenneth had preyed upon, who were now our family. They stood by me, my silent community, proving that my act in the square hadn't been an act of vengeance, but an act of liberation for them all. My house, now officially in my name, became a home again. I kept the sewing business, but I also started working part-time at my father's old stationery shop, helping the new owners. The smell of paper and ink, the scent of my youth, was a daily reminder of the innocent dreams I had nearly lost. Today, at 84, I sit by my window and watch the world go by. I am a grandmother many times over. My children are happy, their lives built on honesty and mutual respect. I learned that the most profound strength is not found in control, but in the patience to wait for the right moment and the courage to break a silence that should never have existed. The Marilyn who laughs today is the girl who was almost crushed by a lie, saved by the woman who refused to become an ornament. I reclaimed my life, not with a blow, but with a whisper of truth in the heart of a public lie. And this, my dears, is the end of the story of the golden cage, and the beginning of a life truly lived. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.